And now, it's The Law Show on CL 650. A comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law. Now, here's Sterling Fox.
Good morning and welcome to The Law Show here on CIL 650. Our focus today is immigration law. And once again in studio, we are delighted to be joined by Rudy Kisher and Alex Stojcevic from Maynard Kisher Stojcevic, Immigration and Citizenship Lawyers in Vancouver. Rudy and Alex, good morning.
Good morning, Stu.
Good morning. How are you doing, Sterling?
Well, I'm well, thank you. I know that you both wanted to talk a great deal about family class applications because immigration law has changed a lot since January 1st and even more since April 1st. And we'll come back to family law and foreign workers. But before we get to the details of today's show, tell us a little bit about the firm. Tell us a little bit about Maynard Kisher Stojcevic, Rudy Kisher.
We're a boutique immigration law firm situated in Yaletown here in Vancouver. We've been together operating for 10 years. My partners were together before that for about 7 years. And we specialize in helping companies bring employees to Canada. We help individuals wanting to immigrate to Canada or to bring family members to Canada.
And Alex, is the work about 50-50 in terms of company clients versus individuals, all of whom seem to want to get somebody into Canada?
Yeah, I would say that, definitely. I mean, we do have a fairly large corporate practice. We also have a fairly large personal services practice.
And I would imagine with the changes, the rapid changes going on in the immigration category these days, there's no shortage of business, Rudy.
Well, the government, whenever we sort of make suggestions as to how they should change things, they say that we're self-interested because we're just creating work for ourselves. But the reality is every time the government makes these changes, it causes a lot of consternation out there in Canada in terms of people involved in the process and creates a lot of business for us.
Actually. So the government is creating as much business for the legal community through its machinations as much as any lawyer in the country could do by himself, right?
They're probably our best source of business would be
arguably far more. I mean,
right.
When I was chair of our section nationally in the Canadian Bar Association, which is a stakeholders group, advocate group for lawyers generally, we had this Canadian Bar Association has a strong administration of justice mandate. In 2008, we would normally look at submissions on 7 or 8 regulatory or legislative changes a year.
Okay.
And that was considered busy. Mm-hmm. In 2012, 13, and 14, the current Canadian Bar Association executive in immigration has to deal with 7 or 8 changes a month.
Oh my. Oh,
so that gives you an idea of the scale of the change in the last few years.
So if you think, friends, that the legal community are sort of overwhelmed by regulatory change, and imagine then how those affected by the regulatory changes must feel. And guys, I know we want to talk about family class categories and so on, but help us with the headlines, because as of April 1st, we've had more changes to some immigration rules, specifically the temporary foreign workers category. And over Easter weekend, a lot of stories dealing with this change and dealing with really confused, really unhappy-looking individuals. We saw a lot of stories, many of them coming from Alberta, Rudy, where, of course, the economy is tanking, and a lot of those part-time service sector jobs are simply going away because the economy is in the dumpster right now. I mean, people in the oil community are getting laid off. Imagine how that's affecting temporary foreign workers in the fast food industry. But a lot of very unhappy, extremely confused workers in Alberta this week.
Yeah, the government brought in regulations about 4 years ago that stated anybody that had a work permit would have a limitation period of staying in Canada for 4 years, and then they would have to leave for a time period, and then they could come back. They put certain exemptions there, but anybody that worked sort of what they call a B-level occupation, sort of maybe a skilled trade perhaps, could only work in Canada for 4 years, and then they would have to either have qualified for permanent residency or their work permit would not be renewed. And,
okay.
And that hasn't been enforced. The 4 year mark started in 2011, and April 1st, and so this April 1st was the first time people are sort of running up against that border, that deadline, and saying, well, I can't get a work permit. Employers are saying, well, what do you mean you can't get a work permit? They didn't read the legislation, they weren't aware of it. The government has done a very, very poor job, I think, in sort of making this very clear that this April 1st deadline was approaching. I mean, they've been talking about their citizenship changes and other things on their webpage. They really haven't done a good job of publicizing this, and so a lot of employees, people working here, expecting that they'd be able to continue this, and employers who are dependent on this, people are a little bit shocked.
Well, I imagine, and so this, Alex, is the first. We've only now just a couple of days, literally, after the first 4-year term has passed since the 4-year term was introduced for temporary foreign workers. Before this became law back in 2011, what was the term a person could come to Canada as a temporary worker for before they had to leave?
Well, you were issued a work permit that was either valid for a year, 2 years, or 3 years, and you could renew it provided all the underlying conditions that got you the first work permit were still in place.
Did you have to go back home to renew it, or could you do it from here?
You could stay here, and those rules remain the same. The problem is if you hit a cumulative 4 years on your work permit, you are no longer able to renew it if you are in a skill level B, C, or D profession.
Okay.
There are exceptions for skill levels A, and there are also exceptions for categories such as the North American Free Trade Agreement and for people who have applied for open work permits, but most of those open work permits come either through Canada's treaties with other countries or through the fact that a person has already applied for permanent residence.
Okay.
So what's happening now in practical terms is somebody whose work permit expires in June, who has all the other bases to renew their work permit. They have an employer, the employer has a labor market opinion or a labor market impact assessment. That person may not be able to renew because they've already had 4 years worth of work permits.
Oh, so Rudy, if you let that 4-year original permit come to full term, then you're done. So
Yes.
How far in advance of that 4-year deadline is it smart to get in and start the renewal paperwork?
I think it's, well, you can't even do the renewal.
You can't
There
do the
there
renewal.
is no renewal.
There's no renewal.
There's
So
no
4
renewal.
years and say goodbye.
You have to sort of transition if you want to stay. You have to be transitioning either to perhaps more skilled work, which is probably usually not the case, but more likely looking at permanent residency. And so unfortunately, the changes have been coming so rapidly on the permanent residency part, as we've talked about before on the show, that this new express entry and the changes in the Canada Experience class, these other forms, avenues for people to immigrate under permanent residency have gotten harder.
Right.
So the language requirements have gotten harder. So people that came over 4 years ago thinking, well, I should be able to immigrate. If I work for a year in the hospitality industry, I'll be able to apply for immigration because I have to have 1 year of work experience. They've now added these language tests, and not only added them, they've increased the level of English that they have to have so that they came over with an expectation they'd be able to immigrate. And the rules have changed so much that not only can they not immigrate, but they actually have to leave now.
Right. And Alex, I chose the province of Alberta specifically as an example because there, everyone in Canada knows that the oil, the price of oil is really shockingly low, and it directly impacts the entire province of Alberta economy. And so you can understand the economics, at least, of why the jobs aren't there the way they were a couple of years ago. They're simply not the customers or the cash flow to justify it. But nonetheless,
But that's arguably incidental, Sterling. They didn't know that oil would tank in 2015 when
Absolutely.
they passed this in 2011.
Right.
And they actually did a reasonable job of advertising this in 2011. What they haven't done is they haven't followed up at all in the last 3.5 years since they made the initial regulatory changes. So this is what's blindsided both employers and employees to some extent. The essential tension here, I'm glad you chose Alberta as your source, because it's Alberta that drove this, and it's Alberta that's tied to how it's being resolved.
and it's certainly easy to understand why a person from a foreign country looking at prospects of employment in Canada a few years ago would have selected Alberta, the most prosperous economy in the country.
The challenge we have in Canada, from a policy perspective, is that you have a system of immigration that is about immigrants. It's not about temporary foreign workers. We as a country in the last century have not really done guest workers. Countries like the United Arab Emirates, Dubai, Kuwait, places like that, Switzerland, they do guest workers.
Right.
Gastarbeiter, as the Germans used to say. You go and you work temporarily and then you go home.
Right.
we're not that.
Clear understanding.
Clear
too.
understanding.
Right.
We are a country of immigrants. And the policy bias in terms of most of the stakeholders, including the department and its civil servants, the Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration, is, hey, you come as an immigrant, then we don't have to worry about whether you're being exploited in this job or that job. You have every right of everybody else.
Right.
If you want to change jobs, you can. If you need to apply and get help from the government through a program, a job finding program or something like that, you have that ability. The problem, though, is that we've had immediate job shortages in the 2000s, and particularly in places like Alberta, and that resulted in a policy change on the part of the federal government to expand the temporary foreign worker program.
In 2011.
Well, 2006, I would say go back when
really,
the economy was hot.
Oh,
they started opening it up a lot.
Okay.
And by opening it up
Alberta
a lot,
was hot in
it
06 too.
It was hot.
Yeah.
And then what happens is you have these temporary foreign workers, they come, they fill in the position, and then what happens when you have a downturn? And we had one in 08.
Yes.
And that downturn in 08 nationally resulted in a lot of people going home.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a tension between a system that really is biased towards immigrants, and isn't designed to handle and absorb temporary foreign workers. And the way the bridge mechanism for those two things was going to be was the Conservative government came up with the idea that most of these people had an avenue to permanent residence. The challenge has become, by changing to express entry and all of these other categories that are really biased towards people that speak English well, that have strong education credentials, those people's avenues have been limited at the same time as their ability to work has been restricted. A cynic would say that this is really because the foreign worker file, which was once a pro story for them when the Conservatives were aiming at making Alberta employers happy and other employers happy during Boudin times, has become a liability, and there has to be a way now of curtailing it. And one could be cynical and say that what you see now is the effect of that change in policy.
The chicken's coming home to roost, so to speak. But you mentioned, sorry, Rudy, you were going to add.
Well, I think there's also a disconnect in terms of the volume. I think the department, what happened is the labor market opinions and the work permits, how those temporary workers get here, is totally managed by a separate department that does the immigration. So the volume of people coming in, we're giving temporary work permits out to 150,000 people. We only immigrate 250,000 a year, and a lot of those are family class and they're different categories.
Right.
All of a sudden you have all these people and there's no space for them in the immigration system under our current targets. So they're here as temporary workers trying to get in a system now that is backlogged. For example, there's a great program in Alberta. It's called the Provincial Nominee Program. All of a sudden within the last year, because of this, you have 4 years to apply for your immigration. So guess what happens to the Alberta program? For a program that used to work 3 or 4 months, all of a sudden it's a 2-year backlog.
Right.
So you've got 4 years to solve your immigration problem. You've got a 2-year, you got a great program called the Alberta Provincial Nominee Program you could apply under, but now it's taking 2 years to process.
So do you have to go away and be out of country for those 2
years? You're going
to
have to leave during that time because, well, you could keep working, but probably you've got the 4-year deadline, April 1st coming up, and now you can't make it. Your avenue that was there has gotten backlogged because so many people are applying. There's no way. So there's been no balance here, right?
And for me to add to that, the province, we're talking about Alberta, but you could just look at British Columbia.
Well, I was going to talk about Christy Clark and our need of 1 million skilled workers in the next 10 years.
But to look at our local provincial nominee program, they had to last week announce publicly a 3-month pause in their regular program because their intake has gone up so much since all of these federal government changes that they've gone from being able to process a paper application in 13 weeks now 13 months. And they've had to have a pause effectively in new intake. They're still taking people through the express entry model, but that's it. That's because they're facing the same thing Alberta is.
They were getting 400 applications a month about a year ago.
Right.
They're now getting 1,200 a month.
Okay.
And 400 a month means they have a quota too, and their quota fills up at 400 a month.
Well, maybe the reason for the increase in applications here in British Columbia, Rudy, is that the word has got out. The Premier has made great efforts to let all of us know that over the next 10 years, our province is going to require the services of 1 million more skilled workers. So the word is out there. So people are starting to bang on the gates.
they're banging on the gates, and in the meanwhile, other avenues are being closed very quickly, right? So the federal government, with this new express entry, has made it far more difficult for people that would have qualified after working in Canada for a year. They're no longer going to qualify.
We need to take a quick break here, and I know that we're going to talk eventually about the family class category of applications for citizenship and immigration to Canada, but it's this stuff about temporary foreign workers is just all over the news because it's early April and the changes have just happened, and I appreciate your patience in helping us sort all of this out, as I'm sure you do every day at work, with the phones just ringing off the hook with people going, guys, what on earth is happening? I'm sure that's pretty common stuff these days, Rudy.
Yeah, we have a lot of people looking for, for advice, for alternatives, to find another avenue to either keep their employees here or, to find immigration for themselves.
Right. We're talking temporary foreign workers and other immigration matters. Our guests in studio are Rudy Kisher and Alex Stojcevic from Maynard Kisher Stojcevic, immigration and citizenship lawyers, online at vancouverlaw.ca. And we're back with more on The Law Show in a moment.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.